I have great concerns about what happens to these kinds of public institutions. I think they're the gateway, actually, for safety and understanding, for families actually coming together, for families who feel very different than ourselves, actually finding a bridge. And I have enormous faith that if we allow our librarians to do their job and for people to calm down and listen, we have an opportunity to be wonderfully different people.
Thank you all for coming here to talk about The Librarians, which is premiering at the Sundance Film Festival today. Very excited for everyone to see it. I've already seen it. But I wanted to start by congratulating Kim on her Oscar nomination on Tuesday. Death by Numbers. How did it feel to be an Oscar nominee on Tuesday?
I haven't even had a moment to think about it. You're so fixated on the excitement of Sundance, but I'm sure it'll process at some point. Thank you, though.
Can you talk a little bit about how this story came to you and why you wanted to make a documentary about the struggle that librarians were going through during the last few years?
Back in the fall of 21, I became aware of something called the Krause list, where a state senator in Texas had released a list that, when you hear the word list, you immediately think of McCarthyism. And it was a list of 850 books that librarians should go and look for, with the idea that they should be removed from the shelves. And almost all of these books were targeting race or gender or LGBTQ themes. And so I became aware of a small group of librarians that started in Texas calling themselves the Freedom Fighters, with an F-R-E-A-D. And they were starting to organize and really fight back and stand up and at great lengths, at great risks. And it sort of grew, and so the film grew and went from Texas beyond into Florida and beyond to tell this we've been following it for over 3-year odyssey of these brave librarians on the front lines to fight democracy.
Martha and Audrey, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to be on camera and talk about what you've been going through, protecting books?
It was a difficult choice. When this all started for me in September of 2021, I had some opportunities to do some media, and I said to my husband at that time, I do not want to be the poster child for book banning, but I recognize that speaking up is the only way to solve this. So I forged ahead with various media opportunities, and then when Kim's work came to my attention, I was like, wow, this is some quality artistry here, and I can't think of a better way to get the message out than through Kim.
And what's so striking in the book is that you so succinctly explain what's happening, but it's parents that don't even live in the districts that are objecting to the book. So this is all a concerted effort by the Republican Party to ban books that they've just come across after COVID.
That's correct. It became almost immediately obvious to me that this was not organic. When you're a librarian, from time to time, objections to books come up. It's part of the job. But 12 hours after the first 2 books were objected to at a board meeting where I was also pilloried, I thought this is a very strange pair of books. It was Lawn Boy and Genderqueer. And I just happened to Google that pair, and I saw that in the days, literally, before our board meeting, the same pair of books had been targeted using almost the exact same script in Texas, Florida, and Virginia. And immediately I knew that I was in the crosshairs of something much bigger than the garden variety objection to a book.
Audrey, can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. It's very similar to Martha's. In the beginning, in October, we had the Krause list. I am a librarian in Texas. I was leading a school district there of 40 schools and 40 librarians. And when the Krause list came out, our first major challenge was genderqueer as well. And we saw the playbook recurring across the states and just spreading like wildfire. I too took some media, but anonymously. And then, I don't know that you know this, but in February of 22, Martha's article came out in School Library Journal.
I didn't know that.
And I recognized in her story that what was happening was trauma and harassment. And she was so brave. And I said, there's more I can do. And not too long later, Kim's group came to Texas and I met them, and then the rest unfolded from there.
Sarah Jessica, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to come on as a producer and produce this through your company?
Fortuitous bunch of events came together. I knew Jana, who is one of the executive producers, and she reached out to me and to Allison Benson, who runs my company at HBO Max. And of course, I was interested immediately, never mind my own relationship and connection to books, more specifically libraries and librarians. But I understood immediately that this was something that felt dangerous and felt like a virus and felt as if Kim and her collaborators / subjects were really doing their best to be as transparent and honest, extraordinarily courageous, and that if there's ways in which we could contribute, add value, help with financing, finding a home for this to reach as many viewers as possible, we wanted very much to participate. I have my own deep and decades-old affection for libraries, and specifically librarians. I was basically raised in a library. I'm one of 8 kids, so we were really reliant upon public libraries, not just for shelter, frankly, in the summer when it was air-conditioned and warm in the winter, and this is in Cincinnati, Ohio, and in New York City, but also for the librarians who always found a way of directing me toward the thing I wanted and listening to me and finding a thing that I couldn't say yet, always in counsel with a parent if necessary, or an older brother and sister, of which I have many, you know. And I feel so grateful, and I've long felt that and talked about it. So the idea of these librarians, yes, in fact, in the crosshairs felt really scary and wrong and absolutely misunderstood, and that by allowing this to take place, we were allowing something very dangerous to happen to all of us, and not just our children, but as a community. And I mean that in the small way, and the bigger way, and the biggest way, and who we are as Americans. And I think it's an absolute disaster, but also the consequences are so serious for these librarians. It's radically serious what they are experiencing daily in an effort to do right by their children.
We're only in day 5 of the new Trump administration, and there's been so many executive orders. Are you concerned the attacks on libraries and librarians will really escalate in the next few months?
I'm not able to speak with authority, or I'm not particularly equipped to talk about any of the executive orders that have happened. I have great concerns about what happens to these kinds of public institutions. I think they're the gateway, actually, for safety and understanding, for families actually coming together, for families who feel very different than ourselves, actually finding a bridge. And I have enormous faith that if we allow our librarians to do their job and for people to calm down and listen, we have an opportunity to be wonderfully different people. So I'm going to focus my efforts on these people and what's happening in our states, and not looking right now at the federal government, because I'm just not equipped and aware enough. But I'm going to be paying attention to our states and what's happening there. Mm-hmm. Long answer to a short question, sorry.
No, thank you very much. Maria, can you talk a little bit about your work on the film?
Kim and I have collaborated on several films. I've partnered with her on this one from the very beginning because we saw the importance of telling the stories from the ground. I mean, the librarians are, curators of content. They understand their communities, they understand their youth in school libraries, certainly. And it would have been easy for them to take a step back and accept some of the challenges, but instead they were incredibly courageous and responsible professionals and have protected our First Amendment right and saw the challenge of censorship in the country as a dangerous, as Sarah said, slippery slope.
Kim, how did you go about working on this documentary in terms of finding the right librarians to talk to? Can you talk about the process and how long you spent interviewing librarians, and what was the big revelation for you in working on this project?
Well, I was blessed in that in meeting very early on some of our colleagues out there, Carolyn Foote and some others that had started this group called the Freedom Fighters. They were able to direct us to others, and this network had started to form naturally where a lot of them had already connected. And that's how many of the films Maria and I have made have evolved, where one person says you can trust this and leads you to another. And so it became a kind of baton structure of an odyssey, a story that moved from state to state, and each one added on a different dimension of the story. I was also really interested as a filmmaker in growing, and so this one was a little bit different in that I really wanted to use a lot of archival material in a way I hadn't. There's cinema clips that are, art and life and art, and historic precedent was really important to contextualize this as not just a 2021 to 25 story, but something that has precedents that are interesting, and that's how we tackled it. The edit was, I will not lie, a real bear, because the subject is, I was just saying to Sarah Jessica, it's a real octopus in that there's nothing. It's like water. You kind of can't contain it. It's not an issue. You can't talk about siege on librarians or book banning without talking about the takeover of school boards, and you can't talk about it without talking about white Christian nationalism. And there are all of these things that sort of underlie it. So that was I'd say the biggest challenge of like, oh, okay, that's its own movie. Someone should go make a movie about Moms for Liberty, and just constantly saying, what's this about? And I have a good friend who's a director who said, you kind of can only ask one question or tell, stay on, it reminds me of a dog I had that used to, go off on a scent. No, stay here with the leash. So this was always about what is the story about a siege on our librarians, and what are the repercussions of that?
And the difference, I think one of the things, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that, there's no end right now. Thus far, where Kim leaves this movie is, and we're all going to see it today in its completion, but there's nothing finished and wrapped. It's not wrapped up at all. It is a living, breathing, in real time event, circus, mobilization effort. And so I think that's what's really interesting is that, so here we are today.
That's such an excellent point, because a lot of these stories we tell, friends of mine who had made a film about Arab Spring, these stories, you have to get them out. And there's a moment where you have to close it and get the film to Sundance. And, it's not really a spoiler, but I love that Audrey, toward the end of the movie, says, and I think it speaks to something you just said before, which was that our story is still being told, meaning, but now it's everyone's story. And I think that kind of says it all.
Mm-hmm.
And there were librarians who were scared to talk to you, right? Some of them have to be anonymous on camera because they were worried about being bullied or targeted.
Their own safety. Mm-hmm. That simple.
Yeah, and Maria, you can talk about sort of the ethics of that. For us were tricky about really honoring, because times have changed since we started doing this. And, I always said from the beginning, we don't know what's going to happen in a year or year and a half. And if you find yourself in a more vulnerable place, the contract doesn't matter to me. We need to know that you feel safe.
Absolutely, and there were librarians, for whom their salaries were supporting their families, as I'm sure has been the case for you as well, and that they just had to relent from the pressure at a certain point, and we had to respect that entirely. But nonetheless, their personal stories, their experience, their observances really helped us build the editorial focus of the film. It was all very, very helpful to have their participation.
And the other thing I just wanted to add was the real heartening thing of this story is the heart of it is this group of librarians, but they're flanked by these everyday Americans who also go out of their way to step up and speak out. And they're not, they're not like these liberals in New York City. They're just, regular people who are doing that. And I think that's the hope in the film, is that there's a way to find empowerment, even if some people are feeling like they're living in times where they feel somewhat stripped of power. These people really illustrate a way that we can all be involved in very local levels to do whatever it is we can do.
Martha and Audrey, can you talk about your hope for the future? What do you hope will happen? And what Sarah Jessica talked about in terms of libraries, also how I felt growing up, right? It was a safe place for me and my sister, and for so many kids in our country, millions of kids in our country. So can you maybe discuss what you hope will happen?
Yeah, I would really hope that this film would be a catalyst to more of what Kim just spoke about. I was able to survive the ordeal that I went through thanks to a community that embraced me, and that's because they knew what was going on. I still speak every day to people who have no idea that there are attempts to ban books in the United States in the year 2025. So my hope for the future is that through Kim's film, there will be more awareness of this issue, of this problem, more respect for librarians as professionals, and a stronger effort on the part of everyday Americans to protect their First Amendment right to read.
Audrey?
I think my immediate hope for the film is to create that Horton Hears a Who moment. We have these librarians saying, we are here, here's our story, and for every one of us, if there's two more that say, I am here, and tell the story, we can create a movement, which we already have, but maybe that movement can create the waves that we need in our local communities to raise awareness and to bring together those supporters of libraries and all that they mean to individual families, individuals, our society and our democracy. There's such critical spaces, and I hope that they are preserved in the manner that they were intended, which is free and open access to ideas and the exchange of thought, and that's my hope.
I think it's so interesting in the movie, and we actually, like I've said, I haven't seen the entire completed movie. We will today, but the thing that struck me so much in watching Martha, I was thinking how little support there actually was, and you know, it's been the case for a while now. The loudest voices don't really represent everything that a community is feeling, and my hope is that this movie will be seen, and that we will, find the ways to make sure that it reaches a lot of homes, or however people watch movies today, but that we can do better by our librarians, and that they can have a very robust community around them. And I think when people understand what's been happening, they will feel the violation personally as well. And sometimes when you feel that, you're more inclined to step up and be a sister or a brother or fraternity, sorority, whatever you want to call it. Because I think for me, that was the thing that was missing. I was like, my gosh, there are people, but it's not enough. Those voices are very loud, and they're saying really horrible, dangerous, scary things. They're turned these librarians into very serious villains. Comic book in a way, ridiculous, but nonetheless having impact, those words. And I'm really hopeful that we can do better in our voices. And we don't have to be mean and cruel and loud and say things that aren't true. We just need to say, this isn't okay. I want my child to be able to go to the library. I want my child to reach for a book. If there's issues, I trust the librarian will discuss it with you. Or, there's a million ways. And that's the thing I hope, is that we do better by these extraordinary librarians.
And the books that they're trying to ban are some of the greatest books in the history of writing, right? Like The Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your surprise as librarians when you learned the books that were on the list?
Trying to think of the ones that, the one that got me, put me over the edge, and I don't know that anyone would call it a classic quite yet, but for me it was a classic in my library, and it's called This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. And in my library at the time that it was challenged, it had been on the shelf since 2015, it was challenged in 2021, and it had circulated about 35 times. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but let me tell you, in a high school library for a nonfiction book to go in and out 35 times is a lot. And when that challenge came about, I could still see in my mind's eye the faces of the students to whom I had checked out that book. And I knew how meaningful that book was to them. And it's meaningful because they don't have anybody else to talk to about their questioning. They may not even have the vocabulary to articulate the question that they want to talk about. Yet there are parents who never will read that book, who don't care about that book, but heard about it and want to rip it out of their hands. So it's seeing these LGBTQ plus kids targeted. The books are just a proxy. I believe that to my core. They don't care about the books. They're not going to read them. They're targeting a community.
And if I may piggyback on that, I think there was a moment that it was when my heart finally, I think, shattered. There were many small moments along the way, but I had a student come in when a book was challenged and came into my office, a student that I knew well, sat down in the chair and looked at me and said, I heard that they challenged this book. That means they don't think that I belong in this school either, right? And that was when I said, oh no, this is it. No one has the right to say to a child, you don't belong. And that's exactly what is happening with these books, is they are proxies to identify what experience and what belief system belongs in the schools. One that particularly stood out with me, we had over 120 challenged in the course of 1 year. And there are ones that you would expect, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, I mean, just ones that we're prepared for. But when they challenged the graphic adaptation, it's a graphic novel adaptation of The Diary of Anne Frank, that one sent ripples, palpable ripples across the community. And I just kind of, I pushed back from the table and just, that was I washed my hands of this moment, I think.
Just for a second, I'm sorry, you're probably out of time. Can you just talk about what the stated objections were to the graphic novel of Anne Frank's diary? Can you just try to give us paint
Sexuality.
the portrait?
It was sexuality.
Well, and
Right,
they
but
also,
that's like so.
There's a moment
There's a
where
moment.
she's a girl, and so she's imagining
A young girl.
A young girl. So she's imagining, reproductive organs, and it's illustrated, and so it was sexually explicit content.
and the image that they tend to extract from that book, and they take it completely out of context, is she's walking down a lane surrounded on both sides by classical nude statues. And that is somehow pornographic.
Yeah.
Which is in the film.
Which is, by the way, who's projecting onto that image?
You're right.
Just have to ask yourself that question.
Yeah. And just, I know we're out of time, but the other thing is that something that has struck me a lot is a lot of the books that have been banned are also things that involve sexual assault. And I find that particularly offensive. And, a lot, I remember being in a Texas group with a bunch of young people, some of them women, saying, we learn what consent looks like and doesn't look through some of this literature. They don't learn that through porn on the internet. So these things are essential for people to say, oh, I know someone who's going through that. So that was something that was particularly striking. And the other thing that I'll never forget was when you described your relationship and experience of a kid who takes a book like This Book is Gay and has the courage to walk across the library and give it to this trusted librarian. And I remember you saying, that is a sacred transaction. And that just always
It makes me teary, really does.